I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C., right in front of the ongoing NATO summit. We're just last night, not far from this very spot. President Biden spoke before an assembled mass and got many rousing ovations and all kinds of celebratory, talking about the strength of NATO and where they're going in the future and all of that. But as you know, we're all about the truth on this channel. We're all about what's really going on. And we're going to do a deep dive into what Biden actually said as opposed to what the reality of it actually is. We're also then going to pivot later on to what an actual leader in NATO is actually doing to try and reach an end to the war, not to just continue to try to shovel coal in the furnace to keep the war going, which is kind of the main thing about what's been going on right now, if you're being honest with it. And we have a great person to knock that down today. We have former State Department official Matthew Ho, former combat Marine, and just great guy. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good morning, Danny. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, listen, I bet you're a lot more comfortable than I am because it is it's scorching hot out here in Washington today. Not much breeze, so glad to be here. But man, I almost wish I was there in North Carolina in the air conditioning with you.
That's right. I've got the air conditioning set at a nice 72 degrees. Yeah. So, but no, I appreciate you having me back on. And no, it's good that you're actually there. I'm glad you're doing this live shot.
Yeah, because I just really want to highlight because when I've been looking at even the news, how it portrayed a lot of this stuff and a lot of the comments from last night, it was basically just reporting what he said, just repeating what he said, putting sound bites up without any context. And of course, to an American audience or any audience who's just listening to that, you may think, okay, wow, sounds cool. Yeah, that's really strong, awesome. Then we're really on the right path. But when you start actually parsing it out, you see that there's some real red flags. And we're going to talk about some of that right now. Let's just get right into it. But first of all, this was yesterday from John Kirby wanting to talk about what the purpose of this summit is.
You will hear a very strong reaffirmation by NATO allies this week about the fact that the alliance is definitely going to be in Ukraine's future. No question about that. And you're going to hear about what that bridge to NATO is going to look like more specifically.
Now, let me just ask you this right off the top, Matt, because obviously this NATO summit is all about that NATO unity, so-called. We're going to see how it's not as unified as what it's being claimed. But the purpose is to continue supporting Ukraine, as he just plainly said there, that a bridge at some point in the distant future, they're going to be in NATO, et cetera. So that's all what's talking about. What's not talked about at all, and what I'd like you to talk about a little bit, is what the other side of this equation thinks about that. When Russia, after all it's done in 2.5 years of war, and all the place that it is right now in terms of manpower, the size of its force, its industrial capacity, the things it's starting to learn on the battlefield, when they hear something like that, does that make Russia more likely to want to capitulate, more likely to want to come to a negotiated settlement on terms relatively good to the West, or something different?
Yeah, Danny, the shocking, lack of awareness or lack of forethought or intelligence behind much of what the U.S. and its NATO partners have done over the last decades, not just the last few years, but decades. I mean, look, the flag came down from the Soviet Union at the Kremlin when I was a freshman in college. So this has been my entire life, right? And more or less, you're a bit older than me, so more or less the same for you, right? The decisions that have continually made the reality, which has just created instability that has ruined and wrecked tens of millions of lives, all because NATO was not happy enough with the notion that it had, quote, won, unquote, the Cold War. That wasn't good enough. It had to take all the spoils it could, and then, of course, consume everything that it could, enlarge itself, just make it into something where it could continue to take. And so we saw that in 2003 with NATO going into Afghanistan. We saw that in 2011 with the NATO attacks on Libya. I'm forgetting about the NATO attacks on the former Federation of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. In addition, of course, to the expansion that anyone who seem to know anything about Russia, the geopolitics of Europe, history, will tell you was going to be a big, big problem in the sense the tensions it would cause, the instability and risk of war it would bring with Russia to continue to expand NATO eastward. But of course, NATO had won, to the spoils go to the victor, and so forth. And now we see in this madness, this fever that has encapsulated NATO decision making. Primarily led by the Americans and the Brits to a degree as well. But these last 30 years, where, of course, most of the discussion that you are witnessing there in Washington, D.C. is centered around Ukraine. But there's also a good amount of discussion occurring about China, about the need to expand China into Asia and to have China confront and have China be confronted by NATO, not just by the Americans, but by NATO. And of course, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians have been present at these NATO meetings for many years now, this year not being an exception. I'll also say one more thing about the using bridge as an image. It just shows you just how unaware these people are. The Americans, of course, our propaganda bridge that we built in that pier off of Gaza, is going to be dismantled, finally given up on that thing. It's provided almost no aid. It's just been cost hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm sure there are people in Washington, D.C. And other parts of the U.S. contractors involved in that who now are able to afford second homes and nice cars because of that boondoggle. But it's being dismantled. But so on the same day that's announced, the day after that's announced, that propaganda bridge, that propaganda pier off of Gaza is being taken apart at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. John Kirby's using that word bridge, that imagery, that metaphor to describe the pathway for Ukraine to eventually coming to NATO. And it just shows that just like that pier, this role of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO, this war, it is just an absolute catastrophe where the suffering is immense among the population affected. So whether it's the Ukrainians or the Palestinians, there is just a looting of the public treasury through contractors and the military industrial complex getting rich. And of course, the worst of the worst being enabled, whether it be the Israelis with their genocide in Gaza, or those who have perpetuated this expansion of NATO for the last 3 decades that has culminated, of course, in this war in Ukraine, where again the suffering is goes across tens of millions of people.
Matt, it looks like we've lost Danny. Yeah, and for everybody watching, my name's Gary. I'm Danny's producer, and I'm going to step in here for a little because we were concerned that Danny's in the. Oh, here he is. Good.
Okay, he's back.
And he's in the shade. That's what counts. So here's Danny.
Hey, yeah. Sorry, the phone actually overheated and shut down, so I had to turn it off, let it cool down for a little bit, and move into the shade. I don't know why I didn't think about that earlier. Really sorry. And actually, I can't hear a thing through these. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you fine, Danny, and actually, I can hear you better than before. That crackling noise has dissipated, so I don't know if that was a heat-induced crackling or what. But I'm glad this solution has been. Well, this is just the perils of live television here.
Just part of the nature we have to deal with. While I was gone, Gary, thanks for picking that up. While I was gone, did Jill show any of the other sound bites?
No, we're ready to go. We can start with the speech. We can dive right into Biden.
I'm sorry, Gary, I actually can't hear you.
You can't. Can you hear Matt? Matt, you want to talk?
Yeah, we are all set. We haven't shown any clips yet, Danny, and we were all set to go into Biden clip.
I back out because for whatever reason I stopped having audio when you came in.
You want to go out and come back in, and we'll see if we can correct it. Oh, he can't hear me. I forgot.
Come back in. Is that right?
Yeah, give that a shot.
Oh, Okay.
And everybody, what we can do while Dan, let me show Matt one of the first clips that we had from Biden last night. And the Danny wanted to do, I first said that it was a foolish speech that Biden gave, a dangerous speech, but that wasn't good enough for Danny. He wanted to call, and you'll see that's the title of the show today. He called it a demented NATO speech. So let's just start with this first clip that we have, and hopefully Danny will be with us on the other side. Here we go.
Thanks, Gary.
Make no mistake, Russia is failing in this war. More than 2 years into Putin's war of choice, his losses are staggering. More than 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded. Nearly 1 million Russians, many of them young people, have left Russia because they no longer see a future in Russia. And Kyiv, remember, fellas and ladies, was supposed to fall in 5 days, remember? Was still standing 2.5 years later and will continue to stand.
Matt, how does that strike you while Danny's still coming in here? I mean, I know it's very familiar. He hasn't changed his tune in months, years, really, and he's hammering away.
Yeah, and you wonder how much he actually knows, how much he actually believes. Is that actually coming from his when he reads that? Is that jiving with what he understands the reality in Ukraine to be, the reality of the war to be? I mean, certainly you understand he's going to go up there and he's going to make a rah-rah cheerleading speech. He's going to make a speech that is pro-war, pro the last 2.5 years, the whole democracy versus autocracy. Putin is an evil tyrant. I'm standing up to him trope, that this is also going to be as much a campaign speech for him as it is a speech reflecting on the 75 years of NATO. If it's going to actually, it's going to be more of a campaign speech than a birthday celebration. So that's all said. That's all expected. The concern, of course, is how much does he actually think this? And there's a lot of evidence to show, whether it's particularly through interviews he's given, where he has made comments that makes us believe that the President of the United States really believes what he is saying there, that he really believes that Russia is continually on its back foot, that he really believes that the Russian military has been degraded and deteriorated, that the Russian economy is just a month or two away from collapse, and that, you get into these deeper things about how that's just going to participate this regime change in Russia. How much is he actually holding on to those words as the reality of his own thoughts and understanding of the war in Ukraine and the situation in general with Russia? And so it's a very dangerous thing to contemplate, that this man, and then of course those who are feeding him this information, who, depending upon where they're at, may or may not themselves understand the real reality of what's occurring over there. Because you see this coming from members of Congress as well. You see it coming, of course, from members of the State Department, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, these assertions about a reality that doesn't exist. So you do have, of course, people like Kurt Campbell, the number 2 person of the State Department. Oh, shoot, I'm blanking on his name now, but the current commander of the U.S. military in Europe, that have said in the last months that the Russian army, the Russian military, is larger than it was 2.5 years ago. So that analysis is there, that understanding of the reality of what's occurring is there. But whether or not the political leaders actually get that information and whether or not they believe it or not is another real concern. So you see the commentary that comes not just from Joe Biden, but then from the political leaders that are representing NATO, all these heads of states and foreign ministers and defense ministers that are in Washington, D.C. What they say is just completely removed from what's actually occurring there. And so it's very, very dangerous when you have this type of, and I agree with Danny, and I agree with your description entirely apt, Gary, foolish and reckless. And then, of course, Danny's taking that one step forward and calling it demented. Absolutely. And that and of course, I think when you say demented, people are going to assign that to the current controversy over Joe Biden's mental and cognitive health and well-being. But I think just on its own, just reading this in a vacuum, that speech, without knowing who was making it, you would say, my God, this person has no grasp. This person has no handle on what's really occurring.
That's exactly what Danny was saying, is that we're not speaking about the health concerns at all. We're talking about just logistically what's going on the battle and what we've been seeing over the course of time. And Biden, still comes up with this assessment. And boy, he doesn't back down from it a bit. Here's a little bit more and along the same lines.
In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues. And Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine, but make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
In the face of what Putin just said a couple of weeks ago, Matt, I know that you've seen those clips where he basically put forward can't call it a peace plan, but a negotiation plan.
Right.
And he keeps repeatedly calling upon people, hey, sit down and talk. Of course, the other side is saying how we can't trust him. We can't possibly sit down and talk. Well, then what's that leave us to? It leaves us to our own president saying what he keeps saying. It's just a constant disaster happening over and over again, with everything just escalating as we watch it happen right before our eyes.
Yeah, and here's the thing is when you make these statements, when the president of the United States make these statements about how Putin won't stop, we have to stop him, essentially saying military victory is the only option. Well, when the president of the United States says that, particularly when he is 4 or 5 months away from an election, and the Russia narrative has been central to the Democratic Party, to its messaging, to its campaigning, its platform for a decade now. How do you then turn away from that? How do you then ever pivot to anything else? How at this point, because you can make the argument over the last couple of years that Joe Biden could have very easily gotten on the phone, gotten on a plane, met with Vladimir Putin, brought an end to this war. The peace proposals, the peace deals, the settlement offers, all of those things have been there. There's no debate over this. The Russians have been trying to negotiate before they invaded in February 2022. This thing didn't have to start, but since it did, it could have been ended. And Joe Biden, over the last couple of years, could have made the argument that we stopped Putin. I stood up to the dictator. We stopped him. He won't do this again. That could have been the political approach. That could have been the messaging. But instead, they have been following a military victory, a victory narrative. And how do you then reverse from that, particularly at this point, 4 or 5 months away from the election?
And I think hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, we got you.
That's actually part of my concern with this. And on that clip that you just saw, added to all the things you just said there is the fact that he's laying out something that isn't true as being what we're seeking for, that Putin was trying to take Kiev in 5 days, that he wants the eradication of Ukraine, and we stopped him. So that's creating a fake success that we've been successful. And that's not what Putin's ever been about. But that's now you're getting from either it's delusion of thinking that Russia's doing good, or that the West is winning, that Russia's going to lose, and then outright deception, because I can't imagine, Matt, that anyone in the administration, even Biden, believes that that's what Putin was going after. They're just using it to make people in the audience and in the American audience heading into the election to believe that's the case.
If I was more tech savvy, Danny, or more on the ball here, I would have queued up a clip of, if you remember, Bill Murray in Saturday Night Live from like 40 years ago doing his Theodoric of York medieval barber sketch, where the answer was just more bleeding, right? We just need to bleed them more. And that type of mindset where this ignorance, when you have a policy that is built on two prongs, one, a political narrative, this victory narrative, right? And then the other being just ignorance, just in the sense of that what you are building your policy on does not match what is absolutely happening. And so if you don't know what is occurring, how then do you ever build a solution? How do you ever fix a problem? I mean, that's just not a foreign policy or a military operational question. That's just all of us in life. If we don't actually have the information we need, we're not actually addressing things as they are rather than what we want them to be. There we go. Right.
There he is the master.
It wasn't Bill Murray. It was Steve Martin. But I mean, exactly this type of thing, just bleed them more. And so that's what we're seeing here is just the policy is throw more money, send more money. And that lines up, of course, with the political narrative, which is the most important thing.
Yeah.
For Washington,
and yeah, I'm glad you pivoted there to the political narrative, because there's one more thing I want to show from that speech last night, that Biden, in similar fashion, just to trying to create a fake narrative is what we're succeeding on the ground, which you can see, because when people can see that Kiev didn't fall, then they must have been successful, because that was obviously what Putin was going after. The other thing that Biden did is he tried to paint this picture of strength and power that probably led to that very outcome. But first of all, watch this clip, and then I want to point out something that should be, I guess it's not really obvious. It's not, but watch this first.
Even before Russian bombs were falling in Ukraine, the alliance acted. I ordered the U.S. reinforcements at NATO's eastern flank. More troops, more aircraft, more capabilities. And now the United States has more than 100,000 troops on the continent of Europe. NATO moved swiftly as well, not only reinforcing the 4 existing battle groups in the east, but also adding 4 more in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, essentially doubling NATO's strength on the eastern flank. Together, we've built a global coalition to stand with Ukraine.
Okay, that last part there. We built this global coalition to stand with Ukraine. And everything he said prior to that was all about what the U.S. and other allied nations have done to pour more troops into NATO. But Matt, here's the thing. NATO isn't at risk. Russia hasn't been able to get more than 20% of one country on its border with no allies, and they're just scraping it out meter by meter, sometimes kilometer by kilometer, and that's it. All those troops did absolutely nothing, zero, to have any effect on what happens inside the border with Ukraine. Yet he's adding that as some powerful thing. And I'm asking, as an American, why are you sending 100,000 Americans to just scatter throughout Europe when that's not where the war is, and we're not going to get into it, as you yourself said?
Yeah, and that you've got to caveat that 20% number with half of that by being Crimea, right? Half of that being Crimea that they walked into in 2014. Excuse me. You also saw too a couple of days ago, before the big birthday party there in Washington D.C. started for NATO, Jens Stoltenberg stating, the head of NATO, stating that NATO needs 35 to 70 more brigades to carry out its operational plan. Which tells you 2 things. One, in its current form, NATO doesn't think it could fight and defeat Russia in a conventional war. It also may signal that they think they can, but this is what they feel they need to also fight China. Which I don't know how you get all those troops over to Asia, but that's another issue. But it also just shows the fantasizing that's going on here, right? The romantic fever for this empire of NATO, right? So a subset of the American empire is this adjunct NATO, and this expansion of it, this creation of it, of this building it out. So this idea that you're going to add 35 to 70 more brigades, which is just on the low end, that's what, roughly 8 to 10 divisions. That's what, 3 or 4 corps. That's actually 2 standing armies, actual armies, like the kind that Patton or Bradley had in Europe. So that's what you're going to add. First of all, it's a fantasy, Where's it going to come from? Where's the money coming from? Where are the recruits coming from? Because I believe that Europe has many of the same recruiting challenges that the Americans have. I mean, so what you have as well is you have that, in addition to this disassociation from reality, this grasping onto it and just promoting a victory narrative for political purposes, you now have the institutional hunger to grow, right? So you see the military industrial complex.
Towards what end? Unless Russia mobilizes 8 million people and becomes this, genuine conventional threat, which right now it's not. It's a threat only to probably another chunk of Ukraine, and that's it. Even if they wanted to take all of Ukraine, that's not enough what they have so far. So there is no conventional threat on the ground that many more NATO troops would counter, unless you're thinking of going on the offense a la a World War II stop theater drive, which you just talked about, what it was kind of like from World War II. So the question is there more going on here than what we seem to think? Because they're using almost Russia as a reason to add more war, at least to give us the capacity to wage more offensive war. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a second, because that's where Biden is trying to take us, and that's where apparently Stoltenberg, and apparently others, certainly Keir Starmer, I think this morning, or maybe it was last night, said, you know what, man, it would be cool if we took these Storm Shadow missiles and let Ukraine use them anywhere in Russia they wanted, almost as though he's trying to provoke Russia, because it's not going to have any impact on the front lines. We'll talk about that one separately. But first of all the things we talked about, Matt, has been basically aimed at the American electorate or at the Western population in general, trying to make them believe that NATO is strong and we need to support them. But among the Western leaders, apparently that message is not getting through, as Ian Bremmer pointed out.
What do foreign leaders or allies think of President Biden right now?
They don't think he can serve another 4 years. And I will say that is true of every leader that I have met with that's attending the NATO summit. Doesn't matter if they come from the right or the left wing of their respective political spectrums. This isn't news to them. They've reported this from the G7 summit. They talked about this when they met with the president in Normandy.
So, I mean, even in Biden himself, there's not a lot of confidence in why would there be. But I don't know how many people are actually buying off on the narrative either.
Yeah, and it's really curious, right, Danny? Because for a nation, the U.S., for an establishment, elites in the U.S., the mantra that we have to do things because of our credibility is at stake. We have to bomb this country and kill all these people because otherwise people won't be able to rely on us. We won't be trustworthy. We aren't credible, and then to have this circumstance where you have a clearly incapable and incompetent commander-in-chief. And I don't use incompetent and pejorative. I mean, in the sense that he can't carry out the functions of the office. And as Ian Bremmer was saying there, and as so many others are saying, people who, they're not outliers or iconoclasts or dissidents like you or I, Danny, or a lot of the folks who are watching. These are people who are, generally loyal members of the elite, loyal members of the establishment who are speaking out because it is such a peril. And this idea that somehow this nation, a system here in the U.S. that has cried out so long that our credibility is at stake, is now doing this, where we have a leader, a commander-in-chief, who it shouldn't even be a question. You and I have talked about this. It shouldn't even be a question about whether he should be running for another 4 years. It's whether or not he should continue to serve out the next 6 months. I mean, certainly there has been some concern raised about this. In some of the media I've seen, not enough. One of the things we have to make clear to people is that within the nuclear chain of command, within our strategic nuclear chain of command, it is a nearly direct line from the president to the men and women who actually fire those weapons. The way that works is unlike any other within our military establishment, where there are layers and there are generals and admirals and colonels and everything else in between the trigger pullers and the president. and that there is a great time delay between the president saying, go and bomb this country, go and invade this country, and it actually happening. With our nuclear weapons, there is almost a direct line from the president to, say, the submarine commanders, those missile silo commanders, that is unlike anything else. And that's who is at one end of that line right now. And that's just one reason why people around the world, not just in the US, should be extremely worried right now, scared, the better idea. But then also, too, the points that Bremer is getting is that they see that this man can't function. They've been around him. Supposedly at the G7, he was there for the photo ops. He was there for a couple meetings. But anytime there was actual discussion taking place, like, where you'd have the heads of state sitting around a dinner table and having dinner together, Joe Biden was not there. And they recognize this. They realize this. They go along with it because they are loyal servants of the American empire, but it has to worry the hell out of them. And then to get back to this idea of like, okay, what about American credibility now? What about our image abroad now? And even those of us who scoff at that, who you and I are ones who have long scoffed at this idea of credibility, there still is that real understanding, the reality of that leadership matters. Who is at that podium? Who is in the Oval Office? That really matters in terms of how people view the United States, not just foreign heads of states, but entire population.
In fact, I want to go down that path right now. You're talking about leadership. Number one, aside from all those things you just mentioned about other foreign leaders and their uncertainty about Joe Biden, they're also looking forward just a few months from now, where there's going to be a presidential election. And right now, Biden is not leading in that. And the way he's going right now, his numbers could probably drop in between now and then. So everything he's talking about here could be upended. But even before that point, one of the things NATO was wanting to convey here is this system of unity. But there is, under the surface, a growing division, thankfully, that is moving in a better direction, something that it is based on reality. So heading into this, and just the days before this summit started, you had either foreign ministry level or head of state level from Turkey, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Hungary said they want to be looking for peace. They want to be bringing a peace initiative. They don't want to just talk about, like in a train or something like that, just shoveling coal into the engine just to keep it going, just shoveling weapons and ammunition into Ukraine to keep the war going without any idea whether or if ever it could actually succeed. But there is a growing split where people are willing to. And I want to take a look today at a relatively new interview with Bild magazine that Orban did. Not many people have seen in the West, because I think a lot of people in America don't want people to see this. But you see here that Orban is very articulate, very rational, very logical. It's well thought out what he's going to say here. The reason why he wants to go on this path towards peace, which is completely divorced and separate from what you've heard these other speakers, especially Biden. It's all emotion and bumper sticker, but no substance. Mm-hmm. Now watch here. This is the first one from Viktor Orban just a few days ago with Bild magazine, talking about the moral imperative.
The presidency of the European Union, I mean the European Council, simply cannot afford not to deal with how to get closer to peace and whether is there any chance to close the war, ceasefire or peace talk. So if any rotating European presidency of the Council would not deal with that, that would be hypocrisy. So I have a strong moral and political motivation that we have to do something. And my estimation is that in the forthcoming 2-3 months, till the American election, what will happen on the front line? It will be far worse than it was up to now.
Why do you think so?
More weapons are there, and the Russians are moving consistently ahead. So the energy of the confrontation, the number of deaths, the lost lives, the casualties will be more brutal than it was in the last 7 months.
Now, he went on, and I want to jump real quickly to the next one, because that he mentioned that he thinks that the next 2 or 3 months is going to be a lot worse than it's been even over the last 7, which raised the eyebrow. And the interviewer press him a little bit more. Why does he think that? And watch this.
I'm speaking about energy which is invested into the front line. And I had a chance to have a conversation with the Ukrainian president and the Russian president, and believe me, that the forthcoming 2-3 months will be far more brutal than we think.
So he went to Moscow, or actually he went to Kiev first and then to Moscow before he went to Beijing to talk to him. So he's all over the place. But the fact that he talked to both of the two warring parties, and by the way, just on the surface of it, he's the only one that's willing to talk to everybody, which is shameful for the entire West, that the alleged leader, the United States, won't even talk to Russia, much less even have the possibility or even the thought process that maybe we can have a negotiated settlement. We can talk about that separately. But first of all, I want to zero in on his concern there that the fighting may get worse. Does he know something that we don't know?
Well, I mean, obviously, that proximity to the conflict, to the war, not just a geographic proximity of Hungary to it, but his, as you just explained, Danny, his going there, talking to those men, as well as his folks would have done that as well. You know, his his aides, his advisors, his staff people would have met with their counterparts. I mean, so what comes back from that, Kyiv and in Moscow, is this understanding that things are going to get worse. Well, I mean, propelled, you know, as he stated, by the fact that there are more weapons and more men. The front's larger now. It's but also too, just the exhaustion of it all. We need to end this. And one of the things we've seen coming out of this NATO summit has been this concern about Trump winning. You know, we talked about this last week. We watched that clip of Zelensky interview he gave after the Biden-Trump debate, where Zelensky looked as if he had seen a ghost. This was not the standard of Volodymyr Zelensky, actor turned president, able to, you know, if there's one thing you can say about him, is that he is able to perform. You know, and I don't mean that, you know, I mean that in the way a leader needs to perform. And that was gone from Zelensky in that video we watched last week. Reminds us of the video we saw of him with Blinken back in April after the Russians invaded the Kharkiv region and just walked in there. You know, he saw what was actually occurring. And so I think what the Ukrainians are facing now is this prospect that either we can get a negotiation in these next 5 or 6 months before Donald Trump takes office and get a negotiation that somewhat meets our terms, or if Donald Trump comes in office, we will be presented with a negotiation that's essentially an ultimatum. Take this or the United States, you know, leaves you, which was always what was going to happen. I mean, again, we can rewind the tape on all this, and I'm sure there's been several times, Danny, where you and I have referred to Ukraine as the next Afghanistan, that Zelensky was always going to be the next Ashraf Ghani. That was inevitable. So he is now, I think, facing that reality. We keep coming right to this imagery of facing reality, whether it's you're delusional about it or you're accepting of it. And maybe Zelensky is. And so what Orban saw there, of course, was this idea of that the Ukrainians recognizing the political reality of the United States, recognizing the reality of their future, are going to try something to make it so negotiations, they'll have some degree of favor towards them in the negotiations based upon the next several months.
Yeah.
But you know,
we don't have too much time because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield and through civilians. That's why we don't want to have this war during years.
And there's other aspects of this too. Just so he's talking about his people there, right? I mean, is the understanding in Kyiv that they are reaching a terminal point in their ability to man their army? That is all the warnings that we have seen, all the things that have been said over the last 2.5 years about issues with manpower for the Ukraine army, whether it's through casualties or people not wanting to fight and die in this war. Is that now coming to a head? And so is there a PowerPoint presentation, right?
I've actually had sources, some that are connected to Russian side, some that are connected to Ukraine side, that have been telling me, or that I've seen reported over just the last 2 or 3 weeks, actually a little bit more than that, that Ukraine is preparing a new offensive in the August-September timeframe, something before the election, the U.S. election, to show how strong they are, which would be just absolute suicide. Concurrently, there's a lot of evidence that the Russian side is also possibly on the verge of making another large offensive push in addition to what they're doing now. So it could be that after talking to both sides, that's what the leader of Hungary had on his mind, why he thinks there's about to be a lot of bloodshed, because he is right. If Ukraine does launch this, it would be suicide on a mass level. But that also underscores why Orban is saying, hey, we need to get this over. And now I want you to see this next clip here, that in contrast to what Biden has always said, and what all the senior leaders and spokesmen for America say about how Putin is the evil guy, he's like Hitler, he's the new Hitler, everybody loves that one. And so they want to say, no, there can't be a negotiated settlement because it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be right to the Ukraine side. Watch Orban's answer to that.
The job for me now is not to say that who is good, who is bad. The situation is obvious. Putin and Russia started the invasion against Ukraine. But I would not like to be indulged into a kind of measurement, who is responsible for what and so on. My duty is to concentrate on how we can create peace. And the only way is that sending clear signals to the fighting parties, guys, we, the world, would like to have peace. To stop killing each other, let's start to negotiate, or at least understand that there is no solution on the ground. Because my starting point of the situation, understanding of the situation, is that there is no solution of this conflict on the side of the front line.
Now, there's a point I want to make here, Matt, is that if the West had and Russia had come to an agreement at the Istanbul agreements in March, April of 2022, just 2 months into the war, I think that there would have been a legitimate shot at having a relative peace that could have endured. And with deft diplomacy in the months and years that followed that, it could have actually stabilized into something. I think there was a good chance for that. I really do. But now then, I think we have to be honest, and because of all the things that have happened over 2.5 years, the extreme hatred and animosity of both sides against the other, means that even if we do what Orban says there, and I'm completely supportive of doing exactly that, anything that ends the killing today is a good thing, and then we can start off on trying to make a negotiated settlement over time, have an armistice, something like that, so that we can try and settle this over time, stop the killing and the destruction. But I am already seeing lots of signs from the Russian side, and lots of signs, even more signs from the Western side, most recently by the departing head of the British military, that they're both building up arsenals and plans because they think they're going to fight again in 3 to 5 years. And so both sides, even if this is over today, we're going to subsequently have to start putting our effort into tamping down these warmongers on either side here so that they don't just lay the foundation for the next and much bigger war.
Well, I mean, just look at the language that you're hearing, where you're at there, Danny, at the NATO celebration. It's religious, and you could swap out some words and it doesn't sound too different from what was said, 1,000 years ago, that we need to retake Jerusalem. And that becomes the mantra, that becomes the defining mission, that becomes the whole purpose of NATO, is to retake the Donbass, is to retake Eastern Ukraine. And so I have those same fears as well, that you would have another war in 2, 3, 5, 10 years time. But I'm also completely in agreement with you as well that stop the fighting now. We are already in this war, end this war. If it's an ugly, frozen conflict where negotiations just go round and round, so be it. The suffering has been halted. There's a chance to rebuild. There's a chance to repair. There's a chance to heal, as well as it takes away the immediate dangers of escalation, whether escalating the war horizontally or vertically, whichever way. It takes that away. It takes it off. You're taking something off a burner at this point. But that fear is there, is that when you hear everything you're hearing at NATO, about the need for a larger NATO, an investment in NATO, and you then couple it with, okay, what are we doing this for? And we talked a bit about their focusing more on China, but the immediate desire, the immediate purpose, the immediate reason for being is the retaking of Eastern Ukraine. You can very easily see how that dominates and becomes the worldview of NATO heads of states and NATO foreign ministers, that this reconquest, that the Donbass is the new Jerusalem, that has to occur. And then, of course, you can make similar arguments on the Russian side why it would be likely that it could start again. But certainly the priority needs to be, as Viktor Orban is saying, to end this war right now, stop the killing, stop the danger of the escalation continuing, and give negotiations a chance. Because the other thing, too, is that you're always going to have something that pops up when the two sides are fighting. Something that always occurs that makes negotiations hard. So whether it's an ATACMS missile killing kids on a beach in Crimea, whether it's a Russian missile hitting a children's hospital in Kyiv, there's always going to be something that allows the opponents of negotiation to say, aha, see, this is why we shouldn't be negotiating. And so you need a ceasefire to allow negotiations a chance for success, because otherwise
one of the things on the Russian side is that I've been noticing, and we'll see how Putin stands up to this, but he is constantly even in their media, the government controlled media still has some level of freedom, especially on those who are on the right. And they're saying, hey, forget about talking. We don't want to talk anymore. We tried to talk before. They keep throwing it in our face. There's nothing to do now, because if we have a negotiated settlement, this is what the Russians are saying, that'll give them time to rebuild, and then they'll just come back with another war, which is ironic because that was the mantra from the other side. It used to be that everybody was saying, no, if we have a ceasefire, it'll help Russia because they'll rebuild their strength. But now then the Russians are saying it of the Ukraine side. So you see both sides are getting more and more towards conflict. And like if they get to the mentality that it's inevitable, then as has happened many times in human history, as you kind of alluded to there, going back even 1,000 years, we could be in a difficult spot. But the only way that we can avoid that horrific outcome, and nothing is guaranteed, but we are definitely trending that way, is you have to be able to talk to those you don't like. And that was the last real point that Orban made here.
Even before Russia bombs were...
Wrong one.
For we Europeans should have our own approach to this whole conflict. And what I see now, there is no real intention to do so, especially because they think that there is nowhere for dialogue. And my trip to Kiev and to Moscow is a clear evidence that there is a way to have direct communication, diplomatic channels, unblocked, and all that kind of thing. It depends not exclusively on us, but very much depends on us how we would like to argue in favor of peace, not the continuation of the war.
So in kind of closing, Matt, we're kind of in a really delicate situation here. Because here, just a few meters this side of that fence right there, you've got all the Western leaders are meeting, and they're talking about ways to keep shoveling coal in the fires to make sure the war keeps going on, even though they have literally no plan for it to actually come to any kind of positive conclusion, other than maybe another 3 to 5 years, and let's see what happens later. You have the Russian side is continuing to build up. I saw from Dmitry Medvedev on Telegram earlier this morning that he posted that said, we need to also be ready for what happens even after there's a peace, and we're continuing to build our economic and industrial capacity. Everyone seems to be moving towards war. We also have this election that's coming up here, which could completely upend things. So who knows how that's going to work out. And then you have, as Orban also alluded to, there could be a big uptick in killing and fighting on the front lines. More people could be dying, which it always is unpredictable. No one knows what's going to happen with that or what it could spark different. This is a very, very dangerous and tumultuous time. The last thing I would like to ask you is, in that environment, in that horrible environment, what can people do? What can leaders do to try and pour water on that coal fire to try to get us towards some kind of negotiated settlement so we don't have an explosion?
In terms of what leaders can do, it needs to be more like what Viktor Orban is doing. Have the temerity, have the gall to fulfill your obligations as a head of state. I mean, he talked about having political and moral reasons for what he did, but he also has a obligation for his office to do such a thing. And I think that's what you need more of is people like Viktor Orban, and recognizing all the warts and issues with him aside. On this one issue, we need more world leaders like him, rather opposed to say than like President Stubb of Finland, who is it's as if he's already auditioning to be the next NATO leader after excuse me, what's his name from Holland, who's taken over from for Stoltenberg. But I mean, so you need more of that. You just need that action, and whether it comes from smaller states like Hungary, or whether it comes from places like Brazil or India or China, that type of pressure put on both sides to negotiate is what needs to happen. Those who have some form of leverage need to be able to exert that leverage and utilize it to force the two sides to talk. This is essentially what the Trump peace plan for Ukraine is. Whether or not it actually is something that exists, whether or not it's actually something he would ever do, it's hard to imagine if his cabinet includes Tom Cotton and Nikki Haley that this is what it would look like. But this idea of using the leverage you have to achieve some result, and this is should have always occurred with American sending of weapons, munitions, aid to Ukraine, was to have coupled it with a really realistic determination to achieve some type of negotiated settlement. And of course, what we've seen is that didn't occur. That didn't happen. And so now, best case, you're losing Eastern Ukraine to Russia in a negotiated settlement. What has to happen is leaders need to step up. They need to accept the reality. They need to recognize the dangers ahead of them. They need to see that, based again on the last 30 years, that sticking with the U.S., sticking with the American empire may be good in their short-term interest, particularly for themselves or for their own particular institutions. But in the long term, it is very dangerous. We'll throw out one of our favorite Henry Kissinger quotes, right? It's dangerous to be America's enemies, deadly to be America's allies. And that's what I think one of the things that motivates someone like Viktor Orban as well is the notion that he is right there. And I think he has the understanding that the Americans, and to a degree the Brits and the French as well, the nuclear powers of NATO, view the rest of Europe as expendable. That time to de-escalate is after Helsinki has been atom bombed, right? It's the time to de-escalate is after Russian troops are in Romania or whatever, because those things aren't going to happen to the Americans, right? Those things may not happen to the Brits or the French. So allow those in Eastern, Central, Western Europe, Scandinavia, the Balkans, wherever, to be the ones that are a buffer of our policy, so that we can, that's the American way of war, that's imperial war, have others absorb the costs. And certainly that's the way the Americans in Washington, D.C. right now, Joe Biden and his people view that, is that we can escalate this war up to a point because there are others who will absorb the cost. It'll be the Scandinavians, it'll be the Balkans, it'll be the Central Europeans, et cetera, who
Matt, we may say that, we may think that, but there is an ultimate bill to pay on that. And one of these days, we think it's going to be somebody else who's going to pay the bill, but that life has a way of boomeranging back around and hitting you in ways that you never thought it would, that you never could have foreseen coming, and that is permanent in its consequences. And that's one of the things that I worry about. We are so locked into a military solution to every problem and almost have just killed the spirit of diplomacy. It almost doesn't even exist, even in the State Department, for crying out loud, much less in the White House. And I pray to God that changes, and I just hope for more people like Orban who stand up, and as he said in one of the previous clips we showed earlier in the week, he's motivated by his national interest, because he's right. His people are on the front lines, and there are a border state, and we need more people to start standing up like that. We've seen 4 heading into this, but 4 out of 32. We need to see a little bit more, but we'll see how this continues to shake out. We'll continue to find out what happens on the other side of this wall right here as the week goes on, and look forward to hearing from you in the future. But thanks for coming on today and giving us your views on this.
All right. Thanks, Danny. And thanks everyone for watching and listening.
And we do indeed thank you guys. And we ask you to like and to subscribe, because that's one of the ways, folks, that we get this kind of information out there. Look, if you know anything about what we've shown here and what the major media is showing, and just kind of talking about just repeating what he said without any context, you're only getting that from here. And we can't give more people the truth if we don't get more likes and subscribes. And we also invite you to join our channel, because there's additional perks and benefits that you can only get if you're a member of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army. We're going to have a huddle just this Friday, so that's just 2 days from now. So we'd love to have you be a part of that. We've had a number of them, always a great time. You get a chance to interact with us. We want to hear from you. We want to see what's important to you, where in the world you're from, all kinds of great things, benefits for everybody. Be sure and join, and we will see you on Friday. And we will also see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, because we have John Mearsheimer and the ever-famous Colonel Jacques Beau, two of our absolute favorites, best voices. You're not going to want to miss that. We'll see you tomorrow at Daniel Davis Deep Dive.